Welcome to this 10-part series about the Danish author Martinus, hosted by me, Lauge Schøler, and my co-host Karsten Jensen. The aim of this series is to provide an in-depth overview of Martinus and his work, the Third Testament. Martinus is mostly known in Scandinavia. However, there is a growing interest around the world in non-dogmatic approaches to spirituality, and as such, many non-Scandinavian speakers whom we assume will find his teachings interesting. But since most material about Martinus is in Danish, it can be a challenge for people outside of Scandinavia to know where to start or get a proper overview of the material. Over these 10 episodes, we dive into some technical detail as we try to convey some of Martinus's ideas. Martinus's work is vast and complex and takes up over 10,000 written pages, but we have picked 10 of the most central ideas to explore. We strive to make it as accessible as possible, and we hope it can provide the initial understanding of the most basic concepts that will make further study of his text more digestible. If you're interested in Martinus and his cosmology, you're welcome to visit martinus.dk for more information. In Denmark, there's an institute in Copenhagen which maintains the day-to-day administration, and there is a summer holiday center in Klint in northern Sjælland, where people interested in Martinus meet and study his works. Please enjoy. Okay, so welcome back. This is episode 2 of the podcast series, and the topic today is the world state and politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And world situation.
Yeah. We're trying not to get too much into the current situation as it is today of this podcast recording.
Yeah.
But the thing is that Martinus, when he wrote Livsbog, the Book of Life, actually the first part of volume 1 of that book was actually about the world situation, as he explained it. He didn't go into karma, reincarnation, and so all that stuff that came later on. So in the beginning, it was like he was trying to explain the current world situation from his perspective to the readers.
Yes, and he mentions World War One, which was quite recent at that time, but he doesn't go into a lot of details. And he's painting with a large brush, you could say. It's the overall picture. So when he's talking about the world situation, he actually is talking about life in the previous century and this century. So it's in rather broad terms. He's talking about the world situation.
Exactly, and he also wanted his books to be current and relevant for a couple of centuries. So he doesn't dive into any so much particular episodes.
No.
And current events or particular people. In his work, he rarely mentions particular people.
Yes. So he talks a little about the world wars because he saw them as significant, and he also believed that we might be venturing into another world war, which we haven't seen so far. But he had kind of premonitions that the way things are, that could actually happen. Yeah. So he's looking at world wars, and he's connecting it to the concept of Judgment Day, as it's expressed in the Bible. So Judgment Day is not a particular day, but it's kind of an epochy.
Yeah.
So it's a century perhaps or so, where there's this culmination of darkness and evil in different forms in the human life and human situation.
Exactly, and I think a very interesting perspective he has is that he describes the current turmoil and world crisis and all this release of dark karma and all the suffering we see today as what he calls birth pangs of a birth of a new earth. And I just want to give one hint for kind of a visual aid for listeners if they want to look up symbol number 11, also called the main symbol on martinus.dk. It can perhaps assist your understanding of this, because there you can see kind of the journey from our current state of the planet and the world into what he calls the journey towards the real human kingdom, which is the whole point of the culmination of the Earth's development.
Yes, so the way Martinus said it is that we mentioned it last time that we're human beings, but we're not perfect as human beings. And it's part of evolution that we have to become perfect as human beings, but also that this is something that can only happen through our own participation in the process. We need to freely participate in this process that eventually will make us what he calls perfect as human beings created in the image of God.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the aspects when I started learning about Martinus cosmology, one thing that really attracted me was this idea that, of course, the planet and the beings, it has to culminate in something. It made intuitive sense to me. Of course, it was right that the planet as we see now and the society of the planet, the human society, it has to culminate in something. Because otherwise, like, what's the point? Because that's usually what you hear about in a normal materialistic, atheistic worldview. Like, everything is random, everything is directionless. But what Martinus says is, like, it has a direction. It's going to culminate in a proper world state, one world government.
Yes, and one thing that is important is that in Martinus' view, it's not a direction or an orientation in evolution that contradicts our freedom.
Yeah.
So still he has this very important aspect that that we cannot but come to a place where we want to participate freely in this process.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that also kind of informs his view on politics.
Yeah.
So he's reading politics into this larger evolutionary scheme.
Exactly.
And maybe so we'll have another broadcast or podcast on where we will deal with his concept of evolution and how that unfolds in his worldview. But briefly, perhaps we should mention that he sees evolution as something that has some kind of two main parts, and one of the parts he calls actually involution.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the essence of this part is it's the living being's desire to become one with matter.
Yeah.
And to become separate from all other beings, and to experience itself as an individual, a unique individual, and also living in an estranged universe, you could say.
Yeah.
A universe that doesn't seem welcoming because it's so different from us.
Yeah.
In that experience. And so this is a part of the overall, say, evolutionary scheme. He also talks about oneness longing for the manifold.
Yeah.
And then there's another part, which is the manifold longing for oneness.
Exactly.
And this is where we enter into this process of voluntarily coming into kind of communion with other beings, not only other human beings, but living creatures overall, and even with the planet that we live on, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And I see it also, we can see it in the urge that many people have towards peace. And that's what I also found attractive with Martinus, that this longing that many people have for peace within themselves and for world peace, that is not an accident. That is part of the divine mechanism, part of the divine process, so to speak, because we've been so saturated by strife and struggle and pain and dark karma and so on that we're really longing for world peace. And that hunger is part of the plan, so to speak. So,
yeah. And this is also where these world impulses that we talked about the last time play a role. So they're kind of an aid to humanity. They come at rhythmically, they come at different intervals. There are these impulses that kind of change the human culture.
Exactly.
And so he talks about there being an old impulse, and actually there are more. But if you go further back, you could say that the ancient impulse was about limiting a propensity for revenge and revenge running wild.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the Old Testament, you have this thing about an eye for an eye.
Sure.
And this is actually
progress.
Progress.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if the background is a situation where it's 10 eyes for one eye,
exactly.
or it's a whole family eradicated for one person being killed, that's a progress. And so this impulse is still rather strong in the minds of human beings. This
exactly.
Principle of justice, you could call it, consequence, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Because what he says about that, the current human being is like a wounded fugitive between two realms, because we're going from the animal kingdom to what he called the real human kingdom, which we'll also dive into in a later episode. And that's what also I found interesting, that we have been for so many years, so many eons of time, been in a state of struggle and survival of the fittest. And now the tide has begin to turn. So now it's more about forgiveness, as he says. And I think that's many people that feel this impulse towards peace, but it can also be, for many people who are maybe atheistic, who don't know about Martinus and so on, it can be difficult to believe that we should suddenly just abandon a million years of evolution and strife and hardship and so on, and then suddenly just believe that everything is going to be great and paradise on earth. And so most people, they say, like, that's too naive. Like, human nature, in quotation mark, is not going to change overnight. But that's what actually Martinus, he says, like, human nature is changing through the karma that we are experiencing.
Yeah, but it's very slowly.
It's very slowly. And you can see it also, like this impulse I mentioned about that towards world peace, like everything you see about the UN and Red Cross and healthcare systems and a more just justice system and so on. All these are aspects, variation of this world impulse towards more world peace. We can see this in the idea of moral progress, for instance. Like 2,000 years ago, it was normal to execute people by crucifixion or having gladiatorial combats and so on. And nowadays we would view this as barbaric.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And also, when he talks about these world impulses, so there was this, you could say, rather ancient world impulse that put a limit to revenge, an eye for an eye. But then there was this new impulse that came with the Christ, where forgiveness becomes a moral value.
Yeah.
And so Martinus actually when he looks at the political spectrum of today, from left to right, he sees a connection to these world impulses.
Yeah.
So at one time, for example, I heard a Danish right-wing politician. He said that right-wing politicians or people who believe in right-wing ideals, they have a preference for consequence.
Exactly.
And for example, consequence could be that some are born rich, some are born poor. That's just a fact of life we have to accept. It's the consequence of how things are. Yeah. And it's not the purpose of the state to remedy these inequalities. And also often they'll go very hard on justice, for example, crime. They're tough on crime typically if they're on the right wing. And according to Martinus, that's actually a kind of secularization of these ancient religious or moral values that came with this rather ancient world impulse that informed and inspired what's called the Old Testament in a Christian context. Yeah. And then on the left wing, you have values that actually go back to the values, the moral values and ideas that come in with the New Testament.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. About compassion and so on.
Yes. Yeah. And also some kind of forgiveness, or the fact that the state should try to remedy these inequalities that we are born into. Yeah. And you have you have progressive tax systems and so on, where the rich are taxed relatively more than poorer people and so on. And so in Martinus's view, this all goes back, in a sense, to this impulse that came with the Christ and the events that are documented somehow in the New Testament.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you also mentioned that Earth is it's in a ripening process. Right now, it's like an unripe apple, and he says like many people that have anxiety or existential crisis and so on. Of if you just look at the world and the current state with war and diseases and chaos and financial collapses and so on, you can easily get mentally distressed from looking at that and say, is it never going to end? Is everything going to go to hell in a handbasket? And is it just going to be endless chaos from now on? But it says that it's because we have, from our normal non-cosmic consciousness state, we don't have the overview. We don't see like the whole process, and we judge it as an imperfect process because we're still ripening, and the fruit, so to speak, is still in a bitter and sour state, but it will blossom into this, what you call the real human kingdom.
Yeah, so he also sometimes used the image of a building site.
Yeah.
Where it can look rather chaotic when you're in the process of building something.
Yeah.
And so this is also an image he used to describe our current situation in the world.
Yeah.
That we are being rebuilt into another kind of being with another kind of morality.
Yeah.
And a part of that, I mean, it's the same if you look at the birth of a child. It's not a pretty picture.
Yeah, exactly.
So he thinks we need to have an overview over the larger picture actually to understand what is going on right now.
Yeah, that's true. And he says like it's a desire that's been built up for a long time, because in the Old Testament it's described how you must work yourself to the bone, and you should sweat just to get your daily bread and so on, as if it's like a constant human condition. And he said, like, from these eons of time that we've been first monkeys and then primitive people and then living in very primitive societies and so on, it was a harsh struggle against the elements and against the environment and so on. And all this struggle has created a desire in people for more peace and more comfort and so on. And that is actually going to happen in the long run.
Yes, and another thing we could say about this, you could say politics and its connection to religion. In Martinus's view, there's something he calls the religious instinct.
Yeah.
And he actually goes, when he described this religious instinct, he goes back to some very ancient times when back when there were no humans still, so there were only animals, and he talks about a small animal being attacked by a predator, and having this cry of anxiety.
Yeah.
And then he describes this cry of anxiety, which is an instinctive reaction.
Yeah.
Is actually the basis for what he calls the religious
impulse,
instinct, or religious principle.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as this, you could say, what happens down through the ages is that this cry of anxiety becomes cultivated.
Yeah.
So it becomes religion, but it also later on becomes science and development of technology, and it becomes politics as well. Sure. All the different things we do to try to overcome that in our life, which is unpleasant or uncomfortable or dark.
Yeah.
So it's this basic urge towards the light, to overcome dark things in our lives, that he calls the religious principle or the religious instinct, no matter the kind of expression, no matter whether we believe in God or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. An interesting thing is that, as I also mentioned in the previous episode, that what is happening now with Earth and beings living on Earth, it's a part of a natural process that has been going on forever and will go on forever. And that Which is not. This is not the only planet where this process is happening, because it's been going on billions of other planets before, which has been initiated into cosmic consciousness, and it will happen to billions of planets after us in the endless ladder of evolution. And that's also what you mentioned about that the galaxy and beyond this galaxy, it's teeming with life. It's teeming because the whole thing is alive. And then there's the billions of planets just in this galaxy, which are been going through this process, and a lot of planets who are in a culminated state of this one with God and in a perfect cosmic consciousness state.
Yeah, so he also, I mean, in a way, he sees this process of evolution as you talk about this culminating state, and in many ways, it's like a flower, a plant, having these different stages. First being a seed, then growing into leaves, then become. I think it's called sepals, which are carrying the leaves.
Sure.
Sorry, the flower, the petals.
Yeah.
And then you have the kind of reproductive organs of the plant, and then eventually you have the fruit.
Yeah.
So you very much see human life and human society developing in ways that are analogous to this process of growth in the plant.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Which, and of course, it has to culminate in something.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's going somewhere, according to Martinus. And this is a new kind of society that he sees for us in the future.
Yeah, and if you want to get down to the technical stuff of this, then he envisions that it's a completely natural process. There'll be fewer and fewer political entities in the world until the whole world is kind of fused together in a world government. And then he says, and this is one of the very rare occasions that he gives precise predictions and actual dates, because usually he just stays with general principles. But he says that in about 3,000 years from now, then the majority of the population of Earth, of the humans on Earth, will have cosmic consciousness.
Yeah, that's one thing he says. And another thing he says, where he put a number on, is that if you go 500 years into the future, then what he calls the Christ politics.
Christ politics, yeah.
Which is politics based on the values and ideals that were demonstrated by the example of the Christ, that they will be kind of dominating in world politics.
Yeah, exactly. And then, just to have a little detail on it, then sometimes when a common question that I get from this is like, well, we are a few centuries ago we were only a billion people on Earth, and now we are 6 or 7 billion people on Earth. And where do all these extra people come from? Where he says that, well, then it just come from other planets.
Yeah.
So
we can move to other planets as well.
Yeah, and we can move to other planets,
but not physically.
Yeah, and this is not usually something I mention on a first date, because because it sounds a bit trippy. But the principles is there. I see it as some, like, if you have like insects around a blooming flower and so on, that you can some flowers you can have a lot of insects, and some flowers you can have a few insects, and they kind of migrate from flower to flower, so to speak. In the same way as souls can migrate from planet to planet.
Yeah, and of course we need the principle of reincarnation to understand that, how that is possible.
Yeah.
So
we will get into that later.
So one of the things that Martinus was quite keen on is that physically there's no way we're going to make it into outer space. I mean, we might go to the moon or Mars, for example.
Yeah.
But the distances and the challenges we would have physically to move out into outer space, we will not be able to overcome. He was quite confident, and we do not need to either, because we can evolve some other abilities that will actually make it possible for us to travel, in a sense, from planet to planet.
That's very interesting, because I think most of contemporary sci-fi and so on, books and movies, it depicts a future human race that travels from planet to planet and from solar system to solar system. And it says that's not the case, because every individual planet will mature on its own. And if you want to migrate from this, you have to discarnate from that and then reincarnate on another planet. But that's it.
We could just mention that he saw these attempts, for example, to go to the moon and establish ourselves on the moon.
Yeah.
He saw them as an expression, and as an expression of a natural longing that we will have fulfilled, just not in this rather crude way that we imagine right now.
Yeah, exactly. And then if we go into the far future, it says like, because in in a couple of centuries we will have like a Christ politics and a kind of a one world state government, and in 3,000 years we will have the majority of people here will have cosmic consciousness, and then we're still on the physical plane. But then in the further future from that, further into the future, then we will start to permanently go into the spiritual world, and then the planet itself will disintegrate, and so on. It's way far.
And now it becomes a little trippy again.
Yeah, now it becomes a little trippy. But it's just to say that this whole journey into the physical will also end at some point.
Yeah. Also, I think it's interesting when we talk about technology and the development of new technology. That also plays into how Martinus view politics, because as it is right now, so one of the things that, Martinus analyzes how things are. And of course, an analysis is also a kind of criticism.
Sure.
But it's not because he thinks there's anything wrong with things being the way they are. It's just imperfect. And we'll have to remedy these imperfections as we move on into the future. So one of the things you see about technology is that it's made for profit.
Yeah.
And it's made to profit the few at the cost of the many.
Yeah.
And he sees a future for us where all this technological progress, things like AI and other kinds of robotics and so on, cosmically, it's meant to free us from matter.
Exactly.
From the kind of limitations that are imposed on us because we live in a material world.
Exactly.
So it's meant to free us from that, and it's meant to be for the common good.
Exactly.
And this is also how you see that politics and society will evolve or develop into the future, that this principle of everything that happens in human society should be for the benefit of the common good.
Exactly. He talks about various ways of development, but his two most central parts, especially when it comes to politics and government and so on, is that you have moral development as a consequence of feeling, the energy of feeling, and then you have
suffering.
Yeah, and suffering, because the only way to get more moral and more developed is through suffering. You cannot read that in a book. You have to experience it yourself. And then the other aspect to development is the technical. And that's what you get through exercising your intelligence. That's from studying in universities and solving technical problems in the real world.
Daily struggle in life to just handle the pragmatics of life.
Exactly. And I think when I read most of history and sociology and so on, I think, at least from Martinus' perspective, most historians and so, they're a bit confused about why is it that society becomes kinder and less violent. And most people say, well, it's a kind of a byproduct of a technical development and so on. But actually, according to Martinus, then the reason why most rates of violence have declined is because we have become more compassionate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So of course you can, it's very easy because we have so much information these days.
Sure.
It's very easy to get the image that things are moving backward.
Yeah.
But actually we can see steadily progress all the time. Yeah. I mean, even when situations become quite violent, it's still not as violent as it was if you go some 100 years back, where people wouldn't live for long and where violence was, the people who are ruling at that time were like gangsters, the gangsters of today.
Yeah, exactly.
And the gangsters of today are just, it's kind of a subculture.
Yeah.
But it's not the dominating trend.
Exactly.
Although, of course, in politics, you see a lot of corruption and things like that. But the thing is, that you cannot, I mean, politicians can be bent, they can be corrupted, but they have to pretend to be humane.
Yeah.
And this is progress in itself.
Yeah.
That you cannot go anywhere if you do not pretend that it's happening under the banner of humanity or being humane. So
exactly, and there's just one way you can say it is that usually in the old days, it used to be called the Ministry of War in most countries, and now it's called the Ministry of Defense.
Yeah,
yeah,
and that's progress as well.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between wanting to defend yourself, even though it's not the end result in the analysis Martinus will make, because he will also talk about us coming to a place where we abstain from defending ourselves, like the Christ did, for example.
Yeah. He said, because he says like the most dangerous feeling in most people is righteous indignation.
Yeah.
Righteous harm.
Yeah.
Because then you just perpetuate the suffering and perpetuate the karma. Yeah.
And so, talking about this, how technologies are meant to become for the common good. Maybe I should say that you could say the end result of us longing to become one with matter and being different from everyone else, being individualized, fully individualized beings, and also being estranged in the universe. The product of that is actually freedom.
Yeah.
And this is the meaning, according to Martinus, of this process. It's to evolve into a state of freedom where we freely enter into communion with other beings.
Exactly.
And not say instinctively, like animals, for example, they have a flock consciousness or mentality, but it's based on instinct. It's something that happens automatically.
Yeah.
It's not a free association you have when you're part of a flock in the animal kingdom.
Yeah, exactly.
But this is how it's supposed to be in the future. And so Martinus will talk about, he will use a phrase like communism about the future state. But it's an organic communism.
Exactly, because most listeners, they will think, oh dear, that's communism. We tried that didn't work. Lots of suffering. But Martinus means something different than communism.
So he would call the kind of communism we've seen, he would call uniformism.
Yeah.
He doesn't use that word, but that would be more appropriate, because what he sees as communism is simply a society of people who are full of desire to be of benefit and to be a blessing for each other.
Yeah.
And all the time are asking, what can I do for my fellow beings?
Exactly.
And this will, in his view, become the basis for a new kind of society that will be organic. So it will be organic communion and cooperation between the individuals who are fully individualized and who do not feel they lose their individuality because they enter into endeavors that are that has the purpose of benefiting the common good.
And I think I just want to make a brief comment about communism in the 20th century, because I think we had the system of capitalism developing, and it says like it's a kind of legalized theft, because this whole idea that very few people could amass huge fortunes at the expense of other people. He says that's like a residue from the animal kingdom, where you just use your bank account and the money system to just steal value from other people. And of course, a lot of people got fed up with that because there was a lot of suffering connected with that. We have the bottom 95% of the society still struggling despite of the massive wealth that everybody could see. And it was very natural for most people saying, well, why don't we just share everything? And then these ideas of Marxism and communism, they came into the world as a kind of a byproduct, I think, of the new world impulses about people wanted peace, they wanted more justice. And they said, why don't we just try communism? But the problem with communism, at least in the 20th century, was that people were not sufficiently developed, because we have this tiny little sliver of humanity in our current state, and then we still have these animal drives within us, which means that communism, it wouldn't work with these only partially developed beings. So we see these communism regimes in Soviet Union and China and so on just going completely haywire, because it didn't work because people are not sufficiently morally developed to make it work.
No, and also it's not connected to some spiritual foundation.
Yeah, it was very atheistic. Yeah.
In a sense, it's quite superficial, because it doesn't take into account the kind of spiritual essence of human beings. And this, I think, also is the problem of left-wing politics today. Yeah, that it's still operating on this, in terms of anthropology, rather superficial layer. Yeah, and this is actually where I think right-wing politics sometimes gain a lot of force, because there you still find this connection to some spiritual roots. Sure, that actually empower a lot of right-wing politics.
Yeah, I see.
And so Martinus, part of his ideas is to find ways, you could say, to allow left-wing politics to reconnect with their spiritual roots in Christianity, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and then he goes into more details about this. He describes about how there's new heaven and a new earth, the kind of earthly paradise will work out. And he says, like, you'll just have a one world government and you only have one employer. So we're kind of beyond capitalism and beyond that 20th century communism and so on. So there'll be no companies, there'll be no insurance companies, there'll be no border patrols. You just be like one employer, and then you just divide all the work out evenly. So all the duty work that has to be done is spread out evenly amongst everyone. And the point is also that the technology at this point will be so progressed that you hardly have to work at all. Maybe like 2 times 2 hours a week or something. Yeah. And it's also actually fun work, because you feel like you're contributing to society. So nobody has to dig trenches by hand, and nobody has to move sludge around. And it's like it's very meaningful and very advanced, technically advanced kind of work.
Yeah, and he also says that people are most efficient when they work with things they're actually interested in.
Yeah, exactly.
And find is fun. So he says about this world state that its sole purpose will be to secure that every citizen of this world state can work in their hobby, so to speak. Yeah. Can work with things where they have a keen interest, and he sometimes jokes, he's like, you cannot make people go home from work because they think it's so fun being there.
Exactly. Yeah, then you have to, like, if you just have to work 1 day a week or so on, then you have lots of time freed up to do something else. Like, just imagine a society where most people can spend almost all of their time doing exactly what they feel like.
And he talks about us using this opportunity to develop our kind of creativity,
exactly,
our spiritual outlook and so on.
Yeah,
that we will have lots of time to do that in this view he have of the future. Maybe we should also mention that he actually shares Marx's analysis of profit. Yeah, that profit is somehow it's being paid for something you actually didn't do anything.
Exactly.
It's an undeserved gain, you could say. So you think that in the future, of course, we'll have to get rid of that.
Yeah.
Marx also has something he calls, I think it's called time factor analysis or something like that. But it's like we should be paid for the amount of time that we put into bettering the common good.
Exactly.
And this is also something Martinus he sees for himself, or for us in the future, that will be paid according to the time we work.
Exactly. And that's the interesting thing, like in that new world state, there'll be no private property. And you cannot give money or whatever means of transaction is to somebody else. You can only pay with your personally owned working hours.
Yeah.
So you do some work for the world government, and you cannot. So if you want more money, you can just work more hours. Then you have more money to buy whatever it is that you want to buy. But you cannot inherit anything, and people cannot give it to you. You can only get that through proper work for the world government. And by the way, people will be much richer at that point than we are now. Even the poorest people in that will have like much better material conditions that the most rich people have nowadays.
For sure, yeah. And I think also we should mention when we kind of draw this, that what for many may sound like a very fanciful image of the future, that it's not something that will happen by itself.
No.
It's something we'll have to do. And what Martinus presents us with is a vision that is very attractive.
Yeah.
And it's like some theologians, they talk about how God execute power not by force, but by being attractive.
Sure.
By luring people.
Yeah.
So it's like it's kind of a female attraction.
Sure.
And I think this vision that Martinus has printed, that he has presented for us, has some of it's the force of it is how attractive it is.
Sure. Yeah.
To think about it, to think about living in a world like that.
Yeah.
But of course we have to become attracted to it.
Exactly.
For it to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. There's also I sometimes think about that inner longing for peace that I mentioned before. That one of the most powerful meditations I could think of is that try to envision a state where you are completely free of any kind of struggle with other people, and you're completely free of any financial worries. Just imagine how that would feel in your body. To be in a completely, have no amount of tension with other people or with any institution at all. Because I think most people, they walk around today in this current society and have a lot of psychological tension built up around money and about hierarchies and bosses and salary negotiations and debt and so on. And imagine all of this gone.
One of the consequences is that people are very cautious to bring children into this world, because they think about the load that the kind of heavy load that it presents, or represents to have children. And this is also one of the things that Martinus addressed, how young people, young healthy people bringing children into the world, they should be relieved of a lot of the pressure financially and work-wise and so on.
Yeah.
So it becomes more attractive to have children.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's true. And I think in that future world state, you'll just earn your living through working hours, and then you'll pay a little fraction of that to a common fund that will finance childhood and old age and the few sick days that people will have.
And I think we see some of this we live in Scandinavia, and in the Scandinavian countries, and you could say most North European countries, you always see the beginning of something like that. So you was secured in old age, for example. You're provided for. You have your children are taken care for, or taken care of, and there are certain benefits that you are given if you have children, for example. And so we see vaguely some tendencies moving in that direction.
Especially in Scandinavia.
Yeah, and perhaps countries like New Zealand and Canada, where you have some of the same values. And and I think you see also, for example, in the US, there are people are divided on this. So some actually see Scandinavia as an example to be followed. But of course, you also see a lot of opposition, at least when we're talking right now, to that happening.
Yeah, that's true. And he says that he also mentioned that in the future, there'll be no armies. There'll just be like a one world police. Because like, as I mentioned, the UN, as we have now, is like a precursor to the world government. They will have at one point. And then at some point, all armies and navies will be disbanded. And there will just be a one world police, which will be like, he mentioned also that nowadays you should be thankful for the police because they're representing kindness and a proper world order.
Yeah, and also he says that what the state ideally represents is unselfishness.
Yeah.
So when the state, when it's fulfilling its mission, it's the representative of unselfishness, which is very fundamental. Also, when Martinus talks about the state, because when we talk about the state today, we get images from how states actually are functioning. We think about the Stasi in what was East Germany and things like that, or the Gestapo in the Nazi
exactly.
Germany. So this is not how Martinus he sees the state as something that should impose anything on its people. Rather, it's the other way around. That the state and its administrators are meant to serve the people.
Exactly. It's a representation of love for the people.
Yes, basically.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and I think I just one comment about Esperanto. Maybe some viewers have heard of it and some have not, but it's this constructed language which was made by a Polish man 130 years ago or so. And he had this idea that if we all spoke one language that was very easy to understand and very logical, it would make it much easier for communication. And Martinus, I think he mentioned in one of his lectures that he thought that Esperanto or something like it would be the language of the world government at some point.
Yes, and people may ask, well, why couldn't it be English, for example, which for all practical purposes today is kind of a world language. And there he would say that this language shouldn't favor any particular culture.
Yeah, there should be no biases.
No.
Yeah.
So and you could say maybe if you should criticize Esperanto, for example, it could be that at least I've heard that criticism that it's actually a bit biased towards some cultures and some particular languages. But of course, that would be something to work on as well to secure a medium of communication that where everybody participate on an equal footing.
If you just imagine that you can go in a future world state, you can go anywhere. You don't need any passports. There's no theft. You don't have to be afraid of being robbed at any point, and you can talk to anybody because you can use that common language. Just imagine that experience of going around in a world like that.
Yeah.
And he mentioned it's a very logical development because he has this rather extensive analysis about the number system in Liebesbo, about how we had this 10-digit system and the invention of the zero and so on. And there's a whole analysis of itself. But he says that system is kind of goes along the grain of the divine structure. It is divine inspiration. And he says like the number system now is spread out over the entire world and it cannot be perfected anymore. It is as good as it can get. And he said like we also need that particular development for language. So at some point we will have a very logical language that doesn't have any flaws or inconsistencies and so on that most languages still have. But then we will purify that and get that to a global spanning language at some point.
Yeah, and you mentioned crime disappearing, but maybe you should also mention that Martinus doesn't envision that crime would just vanish from one day to the other.
No, it's a process.
And also it's, I mean, he sees crime as something that shouldn't be punished because so we should protect ourselves against criminality or crime, but we shouldn't punish those. We should understand that people committing crime often do so out of a natural tendency. So it's a matter of evolution.
Yeah.
And he says one of the problems we have in modern society, actually calls the greatest superstition of modern man, is that we think we're all equally evolved if we're human beings.
Yeah.
But we're not. And so he envisions that in a kind of transitional period where there will be people who have this natural propensity for stealing and perhaps fighting and so on, that they will live in what he called junior society. So there will be no prisons, but there will be what he called junior society or junior societies. And they will be designed in a way so it's actually much more attractive for this group of people to live in these societies. They will be bored if they go outside and they mingle with the rest of the population, because there will be no. I mean, there'll be no sporting matches, perhaps, and no boxing,
no race car driving, and so on.
And also people who are less interested in say traditional forms of sexuality and partnership and so on. So in these junior societies, they will live in. That will be a society that is very attractive for them to be in, and of course it will have to be more disciplined somehow, because you cannot rely on people for whom it's natural to steal or even to kill, to live peacefully. You cannot rely on that. So in these societies, there will be more control, but also more activities that are actually attractive for the people living there.
There's also, you mentioned that he also has one symbol that explains that people on Earth at the moment are not at the same stages of development. We have a huge span from the least developed bushman to the most highly developed person, and then everything in between. And I think it follows, maybe you could say that follows some kind of bell curve, and that is gonna move a lot in the coming 3,000 years. So that in 3,000 years, then the majority, not all, but the majority of people will have cosmic consciousness. But it's a gradual process when then slowly more and more people will start to, because now we had Martinus with cosmic consciousness, and then I can't put a number on it, but then within a few centuries or so on, then slowly it's going to pop out, and then more and more people will first have cosmic glimpses and then cosmic consciousness, and then this one world state and then one world government and so on will come as a completely natural process. It will be completely self-evident for most people we're going to have this.
Yeah, and one of the things that make it different today to talk about these different evolutionary stages within human beings is that that was also how people saw it in, say, the 19th century. But at that time, it was seen as, for example, being connected to race, skin color, and things like that. So you have ideas like the supremacy of the white race and so on. And Martinus doesn't see it like that.
No, as you mentioned, you can easily get into this minefield if you start talking about stages of development, and some people are more developed than others. And Martinus means it in a completely different way than most people, when talking about race theory, have mentioned it.
Yeah, so I think that's important to bring into the picture here that he and actually I think it's a help to understand where you are on the evolutionary scale.
Yeah,
There's no there's no benefit in trying to be something that you're not.
Exactly.
So people, in Martinus' view, have the highest level of inspiration and joy of life and so on when they live actually according to the very precise level they have reached in the process of evolution.
Exactly, and he also mentioned in Livets Bog that he has no interest in trying to get people out of sects or cults or religious traditions and so on if they feel inspired doing that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and he also mentioned that because now we talked about stages of development and some people are highly developed and low, not so highly developed and so on. And then he says, because then people will ask themselves, well, how highly developed am I actually? And he says, like, the most important benchmark about how highly developed you are is what can you bring yourself to do? Can you bring yourself to kill other people? Can you bring yourself to eat animals? Can you bring yourself to talk badly about other people? Can you bring yourself to cheat on taxes? Can you swat a fly? Like what kind of level of morals do you have? And is it like, if you want to figure out your own personal rung on the ladder, so to speak, then just ask yourself, what can you bring yourself to do towards other people and living beings?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just wrap it up here.
Yeah, we should wrap it up here. Yeah. Well, see you next time.